Reid, welcome to Constitutional Chats. We're going to ask you to just give us some opening introductory comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Kathy, thanks much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today to meet your co-panelists, and I'm looking forward to fielding some penetrating questions from our audience as well, too. I happen to love this topic. The matter of congressional war powers and the declare war element always summons an interesting conversation, and I'm really delighted to be here to talk through it. I think there's a bunch of stuff that we can discuss today. You know, the differences between declarations of war and authorizations for use of military force, the War Powers Resolution of 1973, where it came from and some of its shortcomings, various case studies that inform both the practice and precedent of how this country goes to war, and debates that are, you know, literally ongoing within the Congress right at the moment about legislative prerogative vis-a-vis President Biden's military engagement against the Houthis in Yemen. But I'd like to start with some history about how we got here. And before we even get to the discussion of textual framing of war powers in the Constitution, I actually think it would be good to start with some constitutional prehistory. You know, we must remember that our founding document didn't just arise from the ether, you know, rather it emerged from the crucible of the Revolutionary War and domestic unrest under the Articles of the Confederation that informed the framers' perspective on war powers. So let's start by considering the context of the original war powers debate, right? And ultimately how declare war becomes embedded in our Constitution. Having recently emerged victoriously from our Revolutionary War of Independence, we had shed the protection of the British Navy, and our small country faced looming threats on all sides. We had British armies stationed to our north and their navies floating out to sea. A malingering Spanish Empire lay to our south. British and French ships patrolled the Caribbean, and both friendly and hostile Native American tribes lived to the west. Despite all of these threats, right, the founders harbored big concerns about standing armies, which they associated with British colonial authority and, frankly, old world European proclivities towards war. Today, you know, when we talk about war powers, we mostly think about foreign policy, and I'm sure we'll get to those questions, but I would just stress from the outset for the framers, war powers really centered on the tension between national security and our domestic governance. There was a healthy fear about the internal effects of war, the centralization of power in the executive that could lead to tyranny, and really a threat of standing armies as well too. So there's more to the matter of war and peace maybe than just declaring war, but that's a good place to start, and you know, the title of our podcast today. So as we know, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution delegates to the U.S. Congress the sole and solemn power to declare war. That this prerogative may appear slow and cumbersome, right? That the Congress, the legislature, would determine when we move from a state of peace to a state of war. It's a feature, not a bug. The founders wanted stuff to get through Congress slowly and after thorough deliberation. Right, so we didn't just rush into war. We deliberated the initiation of conflict. Second, we know that the Congress holds the power of the purse, which means the power to control government spending. This is usually understood as the essential separation of power constraint on the executive branch. It's also directly applicable to military power, which requires great expense, right? When you make war, you know, you're not just buying bullets or paying your soldiers. There's massive capital expenses of raising an army and equipping a navy. So part of the consideration of war declaration was the cost that underlies that effort. And just as a historical aside, I just want to state that I think it's beyond debate that the founders intended for the Constitution to grant Congress the exclusive power to take the nation from peace to war. In his notes from the debates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, James Madison remarks that Pierce Butler of South Carolina had urged that the president be given the power to initiate war, and the delegates overwhelmingly rejected this proposal. So furthermore, I think we should bear in mind Madison's well-worn truism and this kind of plain statement of facts that in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war and peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. That's pretty clear and in no uncertain terms. But moving forward, another cite for Madison, now writing as Helvidius, he clarifies with caution that war, now I'm quoting, is the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. And he colorfully remarks that war is the thumb from the dike of public treasuries and the field from which laurels are plucked to encircle the executive brow. So I think we can be confident that Madison believed lodging power in the Congress would constrain impulses to war, mostly including presidents who might seek glory and the enlargement of the power of their office. And I just want to note that this is a pretty radical departure from the European experience, where for the most part, kings and princes made war for their personal aggrandizement from time immemorial, right? So this is quite a radical departure. Ultimately, the convention adopted Madison's language that Congress shall have the power to declare war, a framing that Madison predicted would leave to the executive only the power to repel sudden attacks. So I think there's a lot to focus on the declare war clause, but I actually want to highlight a preponderance of war powers granted to the Congress, namely in conjunction to tax and spend, right? So in addition to declaring war, the Congress is charged with raising and supporting armies. And it's important to note that, quoting the Constitution, no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years, right? 2 years being the duration of any given Congress, which is an important sunset clause on any standing army that may go berserk. This is an important differentiation from a corresponding clause, the Navy clause, which is simply to provide and maintain a Navy. The power to build and maintain a Navy is not conditionalized or time limited like the appropriation for an army. It kind of recognizes the importance of both the financial investment and the time intensity of laying down capital ships and commissioned shipyards, right? This is not a quick fix. You can raise an army or mobilize your militias, but you can't just summon a navy from the ether. So pursuant to the point raised earlier about the founders' qualms about standing armies, I think it also makes sense that these young United States would hedge their bets on the side of their maritime power. Further in with respect to sort of ancillary war powers, there's certainly more to discuss about the militias clause in the Constitution, which is a nod to state power and the disposition of militias really as a guarantee, as a reality that militias frankly predate the Constitution. But I want to, for the sake of time, also be sure to jump to Article 2, right? The Commander-in-Chief clause, which reads in slightly condensed fashion: the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states. When called into the actual service of the United States, he shall take care the laws be faithfully executed. So, some gets kind of sandwiched in here between the vesting clause and the take care clause, but I think what we do know for certain is that over time, this commander-in-chief clause has obviously been interpreted very broadly by the executive and his lawyers. All of this to say there is a lot more to the constitutional text on war powers, broadly understood, than just the declare war clause or the commander-in-chief clause. That demonstrates, I think, something beyond co-equal powers. I really think that the power lays with the Congress as opposed to the executive as set forth in the Constitution's framing. Now, once that framing gets put to practice, there are some important ambiguities that have to be ironed out. And I think that we're going to see three important trends emerge from the very beginning. First, I think you're going to see a growth in presidential power that's ultimately undeniable. Second, I think there's going to be a failure on the part of Congress and the courts to really push back on this agglomeration of executive authority. And third, and this is, I think, an interesting one to unpack, an unwritten but corresponding power on the part of the executive to affect the likelihood of war, and therefore hem in the Congress. So that's sort of where we start. Maybe for opening remarks, Kathy, is that good to go? And then we can kind of take it from here.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was a great overview, and really appreciate the history and the context that you placed those war powers in from the Constitution. And we're going to go right to Tova with questions.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back. Apologies for being late. I was actually in a class about international relations and war and US grand strategy. So I feel like this is a great continuation of that. So I'm really, really excited to discuss this topic. So I wanted to start off by just kind of taking a historical look at why it is now that the executive has so much power over the act of war, when, as you, I think, portrayed very convincingly, that was not the original intention of the founding fathers. So what has happened over the years that has made it now that the executive has power, and even the Department of Defense is housed under the executive department and not under Congress?
I think that's an awesome question, and I think that's the real head scratcher for students of constitutional history who pay attention to war powers. Why, when Madison and the framers laid it out so explicitly that the Congress would really have a super equal prerogative, has the executive managed to supersede that? And I actually want to go back to a series of letters written between Alexander Hamilton, who was writing then as Pacificus, and James Madison, who was writing as Helvidius. And I think it's really important. I'm actually going to cite here slightly at not terrific length, but something that Hamilton says that I think really has held true, right? And he makes the case as Pacificus that the war powers delegated to the Congress and the executive in Articles 1 and 2 are actually concurrent. They're not entirely separate and distinct. In fact, they sort of overlap with one another. And notably, he explains, and now I'm quoting, "The legislature is free to perform its own duties according to its own sense of them, though the executive, in the exercise of its constitutional powers, may establish an antecedent state of things, which ought to weigh in the legislative decisions." And by the antecedent state of things, what Hamilton is essentially forecasting is the president can use his powers to influence his Congress's room to maneuver. So presidents can't disable congressional power, but he can put them in a real bind. And one of the first times this arises is like, it's almost like the hallmark episode of this executive capacity comes in the shape of the Mexican-American War, which initiates in 1846 and goes to 1848. So at this time, President Polk is sort of jawing for manifest destiny, and his offer to buy territory from Mexico down to the Rio Grande has been rebuffed. So he sends General Zachary Taylor and a few thousand soldiers into disputed territory. Predictably, they're attacked, right? And here's that antecedent state of things at play. When American boys in Mexico are killed, Polk then urges the Congress to declare war, and the declare war clause at this point is not going to really put a brake on the momentum. There's not a lot of debate because we've already lost American troops in Mexico. And it turns out the war actually goes pretty well for the United States, but the peace is complicated by sectional concerns about annexation and, this vast swath of new territory. Ultimately, the House of Representatives issues a non-binding resolution declaring the war unnecessarily and unconstitutionally begun. But this isn't exactly a fulsome display of congressional prerogative. And they didn't really have a chance to put a stop to the war before it was already underway, essentially, when General Taylor and his men were attacked by Mexico in Mexico's territory. So in this case, like, Polk has this sort of first mover advantage, and the presidential control of military forces and control of information as well, too. So how the information actually comes to Congress and what's actually happening. So as is the case now, Congress kind of relies upon intelligence that's provided by the executive branch. If the executive branch has also kind of put troops in harm's way and suddenly hostilities are already begun, it gets a lot harder to put a brake on that. So I think time and again, you see the executive use that first mover advantage, and the Congress isn't able to do much about it other than, because then they're bounded by sort of the political dimension of things. If the war goes badly, then maybe they jump in and stop it. But if the war's going well, then maybe they're more hesitant to, say, cut off funding or something like that. Is that helpful for starters?
Yeah, absolutely. That helps put it in context. So we're not just, spawning today and then seeing the situation now. Um, Something I'm curious about is kind of a lot. I just came out of this class on grand strategy, so that's where my head's at. And I was thinking about the difference in strategy towards war with Congress versus the president, with the executive, because to state the obvious, if the president, like the executive branch and the legislative branch, always thought exactly the same on matters of war and foreign policy, we wouldn't really be having this discussion, because I think people wouldn't really care or feel passionately who had the power. But it seems to me, at least, that there might be a misalignment or difference in opinion or strategy between the inclinations of the legislative branch and the inclinations of the executive branch towards war. And that might be why we care so much about who actually has the power over it. So I guess my question is, what generally are the broad differences and maybe approaches towards war between the executive branch and Congress that might make it so important to really sort out who has the right to make these decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think it changes with the majority minority dynamics at play in various Congresses and who holds executive office. But generally, I would say that, and this is sort of citing Madison, presidents are more capricious in their desire to commit the country to war than a broad legislative body. And that's in part because I think the executive works from very different political incentives than various constituent members of the Congress, right? Who are probably more attuned to their their constituencies, their home districts, even their states, than the executive, who is, maybe more attentive to the Department of Defense or the Joint Chiefs or the State Department, or other imperatives that may arise in Washington that you wouldn't find at home in West Virginia, Wyoming, or Oregon, or something like that. So I think the notion of the Congress sort of slowing the president's role is one that's baked into the framing by design. And that, whereas one individual, he or she, who occupies the executive office may feel compelled to take the country to war, it's wiser to insert a legislative body that has to kind of slowly, methodically, deliberate about the hows and whys of the prosecution of the conflict. And I think this is generally a salutary feature of the system. When a president needs approval from the Congress to either declare war or receive authorization for use of military force, by and large, the executive gets it, right? But it also it induces the executive to present the best case and get the whole country behind him, right, through the legislature, to prosecute the war, ideally most effectively, and towards a satisfactory and victorious end. So that's sort of just a difference in kind of structural design, I'd say, between incentives arrayed before the legislature vice the executive.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful. I know in past chats, it's been described with the analogy of the executive sometimes acting like the accelerator and Congress acting more like the brakes and having that sort of relationship. Um, but I was curious about modern warfare. Obviously, we're in a very different landscape than we were when the Constitution was written. And I think a lot of warfare often happens through proxy wars. So it's not necessarily our army or China's army or Saudi Arabia's army or Iran's army fighting directly against each other, but it's or Russia, to state the obvious.
Mhm.
It's funding wars happening in other countries. Maybe it's not even so transparent who's funding those wars, things like that. So, under this system, how do these war powers function? Like, how is it decided when we are to fund a war? Is that just totally under the president? Is there need for adoption? What is your take?
Yeah, and here's where I would actually cite a friend and colleague at the Brennan Center, Catherine Yon Ebright, who's written a lot about these secret wars and special provisions that are exercised by the executive. For instance, Section 127 Echo. So, like, let me just stand back a minute and say that a lot of times we talk about declare war clause, we talk about authorizations for use of military force. We might talk about some sorts of covert action, right? This gets attention, but there are these statutes that are kind of baked into the Federal Register that allow executives to circumvent, in some cases, almost entirely what I would call regular order. So things like Section 127 Echo, which allows the executive to support foreign forces, paramilitaries, even private individuals who are supporting U.S. counterterror operations. This sometimes results in U.S. proxy forces fighting on behalf of or even alongside U.S. forces. There's Section 333 programs, which are train and equip. I have a sense that you might see some of this stuff in places like Syria or even Ukraine. So there are these other authorities that are almost subaltern to the conversation of constitutional war powers as understood in a sort of kind of law school template or syllabus that do exist, and they are complicated because there is less clarity about their exercise. This, as opposed to when the country decides that it is going to declare war, right? Or even to authorize the president to use military force, right? These are the president is appearing before a joint session of Congress and making a public solicitation for the legislature's support and funding, right? Constitutional, statutorial authority, or actually, like the monies to go forth and prosecute that campaign. These are things that we can kind of hold our elected officials accountable for, win, lose, or draw, right? These other kind of more secret war statutes are a little bit more murky, if that makes sense. So yes, they happen, and they absolutely exist. And I encourage you to read Catherine Ebright at the Brennan Center, who expounds on them expertly.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then for my final question, I want to ask a bit more practically what actually is being done now to try to take back power from the executive branch and restore it to Congress. I know people on this chat read an article discussing some efforts in Congress, which what surprised me was how diverse the party affiliation and ideology of the people supporting bills to bring more power to Congress. So I'm curious, could you just talk about the modern landscape? Particularly, I'm curious about what's been, if anything has been litigated in the court system, if that has been an avenue that has been explored to make those changes, or if it's mostly been within Congress, to give an overview.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm glad you raised it. I'll begin with the final aspect of that question first, insofar as what role have the courts played. the courts have been reluctant to grant standing to folks, even members of Congress, who brought suit against what they perceive to be unconstitutional war making. Courts have generally deflected, saying that this is a political question and it should be handled outside of the judicial branch. I trained as a political scientist, not as a lawyer, so I will leave that to my more legally inclined friends to determine the validity and wisdom of those rulings. But that's the shape of things in the courts. So primarily, efforts have existed in the Congress to reclaim authorities, and I think that there are kind of twin dimensions to how those conversations have happened. I think that, at least at present, there has been considerable attention to repealing outdated authorizations for use of military force that are still on the books. Right, so just a clean repeal of 3 authorizations. One, a 1957 authorization that dates all the way back to the Eisenhower administration that's still on the books, essentially allowing the executive to use force in the Middle East to contend the forces of communism. So this is a very peak Cold War authorization that's still on the books. There's not 1991 authorization that precipitated the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and the United States led a coalition to expel the Iraqis from Kuwait. And then there's a 2002 authorization for use of military force that underwrote the second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq. Right, so those are all essentially outdated. I would say they have no operational authority, but they're sort of loaded guns sitting on the president's desk, and good constitutional hygiene would commend the Congress to repeal this. And I think we can return to this, but I think what we know is that the executive branch will always use whatever authorities are available to make war at the president's discretion. So if you leave these authorizations, one could imagine that 1957 authorization being revitalized by this or some future administration, despite the fact that it was, because it only names, I think, communism. It doesn't specify the Soviet Union, the Soviet being from 1957. You could imagine if China, right, were doing something that we didn't like in the Middle East, you could say, well, the executive has this authority dating back to 1957 to use military force against forces of communism operating in the Middle East. Of course, nobody from that Congress who voted on that is probably even alive anymore. But you could imagine that authority being pulled off the shelf. Secondly, and I think probably ultimately more importantly, the Congress should repeal and revise the 2001 AUMF, the kind of global war on terror AUMF that has been used and misused in many ways over the past 20 some years to conduct more than 40 operations in, I think, 20 countries, many of them wholly unrelated to the perpetrators of 9/11. The 2001 AUMF has sort of a sordid history. It's been on the book for 3 decades. It's entering its 3rd decade, right? And it's been often used to justify military actions that's entirely disconnected from when the Congress voted it into law a few days after 9/11. And just from a sort of normative perspective, I would say that it has not led to a lot of strategic success, right? There have been failed wars. We've got, more than 7,000 dead American service members, probably $8 trillion in costs, a Congress that is in many ways less aware of or willing to implement its war powers, because we've sort of just run on autopilot with this 01 AUMF. So I think that should be repealed. I think there's also efforts that we can discuss if you like to revise the 1973 War Powers Resolution. That I think that's the second dimension of this. I think you have to get rid of or update authorizations, and I think you have to revise and correct some of the problems with the war powers resolution. So those are the efforts ongoing. Toby, you make a really good point. It has been a bipartisan effort. You know, folks from Bernie Sanders to Mike Lee, Chris Murphy, Rand Paul, Todd Young, Tim Kaine. I think folks that are connected to like why Congress ought to care about its solemn obligations when it comes to the execution of war. You know, I think this is a solemn responsibility, and some members I think are really connected to why Congress needs to reclaim their authorities.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you're obviously very well versed on this, and I personally learned a lot. And now I want to pass on to Julie and Jordan so they can ask some questions.
Hello. So my first question is really about the time order in which war would be declared or not declared from the president's standpoint, and also when war is not declared but we are still sending in troops. How does that really work? Like, what is the legal terms for that?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think one thing that I would perhaps begin by clarifying is the United States has not declared war in a formal sense since June of 1942, when the Roosevelt administration, FDR, declared war on Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania in the Second World War. It's been the declare war clause it's been somewhat vestigial of late, right? Before that, and just on like full background, right, from the Washington administration to the present, Congress and the president have enacted 11 separate formal declarations of war against foreign nations in 5 different wars. That's the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, and the First and Second World Wars. Obviously, we fought a lot of other activities that didn't rise to the level of constitutional war. So more recently and more frequently, Congress and the president have also, they've enacted these things called authorizations for use of military force. And I referenced them briefly in conversation with Tova. There's a bunch of them that are still on the books. These are a little bit different than formal declarations. The Congress may not grant the executive all of the authority that he's requested. I think it's actually really interesting to just describe a little bit about what happens when you declare war, right? A declaration of war formally under international law, it kind of seems arcane, but this was once a necessary criterion which terminated diplomatic and commercial relations and all existing treaties between countries. Also, a declaration of war grants almost surreal power to the executive, right? He can take all of American manufacturing plants and convert them into the production of arms and armaments. He can control all transportation systems for military purposes. He or she would have the right of first refusal over essentially all natural resources in a time of declared war. And then finally, he could also deport or detain all enemy aliens who may be residing in the United States. So this is like a massive amount of agglomerated power to the executive. So for reasons relating to this, the Congress has preferred these authorizations for use of military force, which they do authorize force, but they don't necessarily confer like wild power on the executive. That's not to say that certain administrations haven't tried to spin authorizations for use of military force into something resembling a war declaration. So that just kind of on background, there's like different levels of war. There's declare war, that's like World War II, and then there's stuff like, I don't know, Afghanistan, which we could kind of just fight as a brush fire war for 20 odd years under an authorization. And then And then there's other questions raised by something called the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which was passed over President Nixon's veto at the end of the Vietnam War, which was itself initiated by a deeply flawed Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The purpose of the War Powers Resolution was essentially to restore to Congress it's the full intent of the framers of the Constitution is how they phrased it. So to essentially to reorient to the Congress many of those war powers that might have atrophied during the Vietnam era and the Korea War era too.
A really quick question on one thing that you said, because I know I've heard it before, but it's in this context, it's just really big idea, which is you talked about what the executive power that is expanded so hugely under a war declaration. And it's something I haven't thought about much. So our framers were so careful about the executive power and so careful about checks and balances. And was there thought that declaring war was a fight for our country's survival, and in that case he can become somewhat of a dictator, but we have these certain things in place where it's going to be protected from going too far? What was the check on balance on that, on the declaration of war of the Congress, and the president used it in order to gain immense power?
That's a really excellent question. As is the case in other areas, the executive accumulates more expectation of power over time. So I don't think that declare war in 1812 would have looked the same as Harry Truman trying to nationalize the steel industry during the Korean War. I think that agglomeration of powers is more or less seized upon by various executives successively over time. That's an awesome question.
Then I just have a quick follow-up.
Go.
With one of the things you had talked about, the difference between, I think you pretty much covered the difference between the military authorization now and the declaration of war. With that wrinkle in there that it's become even more executive power under the declaration of war as has developed. This is a really different type of question, but when we give money to a country at war, I'm wondering if there's any consideration for the fact that it's not considered any act of war. There's no military authorization needed, but that country that country is fighting against may see it as an aggression, and then you're in an effect an adversary of another nation because you're funding a war against them. Did the framers? Is there any thought about that from the framers or discussion, or do we see that develop over time as we become more global? I'm not sure.
A terrific question. The most recent case study I would point to is in 2019, the Congress, for the first time ever in bipartisan and bicameral fashion, exercises its authority under the War Powers Resolution of 1973 to limit essentially U.S. support for the war led by Saudi Arabia in Yemen, right? We were not an active co-combatant in that war, but we were arming the Saudis and their coalition partners. We were providing mid-air refueling. We were essentially offering them targeting packages so they knew what to aim the missiles that we provided them with. Like, we were kind of doing everything except pulling the trigger, so to speak. And the Congress said, hey, under the terms of the War Powers Resolution, like, we are kind of a co-combatant here, even though our boots are not on the ground. So that's an important question. Again, this is like one of those things where, can you imagine Madison forecasting a kind of global American military posture and an alliance with a absolute monarchy in Arabia that would have been raining bombs on its Arabian neighbor to the southwest? And like, I don't think that the founders necessarily thought that we would have been pursuing a sort of Pax America ultimately, and that we would have been a nearly co-combatant war in a war like the Saudi-Yemeni war. So that's a really good question. I think there's also times where presidential lawyers can say, we're not really involved in hostilities right now. And this happened in Yemen in 2011 when we were engaged at first in a essentially we were standing up a no-fly zone, so Colonel Gaddafi couldn't kill civilians in his country, and we were protecting civilian populations. Next thing you know, one thing leads to another, and we're involved in a regime change operation where Gaddafi ends up killed by his own people. Now, Obama's legal minds maintained that what we were doing never rose or amounted to the level of what we would define constitutionally as hostilities. We were not actually engaged in hostilities because we were just bombing and strafing with planes. We didn't have boots on the ground. We weren't actually taking fire. There were no hostile casualties, no KIA. So that's a pretty wild interpretation from my perspective of what constitutes hostilities. If you can actually do regime change, but you're not on the hook for being involved in an active fight, that's pretty wild to me. Taken to its sort of intellectual limit, you could make the argument that you could drop a nuclear bomb on a country and not be engaged in hostilities because they can't shoot back. So I think that sort of framing is really dangerous and ought to be corrected by the Congress immediately, so that blurry line that you point to between are we or are we not involved in this war becomes clarified. Is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely.
We just have one more question. You had mentioned earlier that we are allowed to have a navy, but we were not allowed to have an army. And yet we have an army right now. So when did that change, or what is my understanding wrong? Could you just go into that a little bit?
I mean, technically, we still have to, constitutionally, we still kind of have to raise an army with our National Defense Authorization Act and defense appropriations on a nearly annual basis. I think there's a couple transitions. You transition sort of from like a military that is around the time of the Revolutionary War, largely reliant on local militias. Militias mature into something resembling our National Guard. After World War I and mass conscription, and then certainly into World War II, and then the Cold War, and sort of permanent conscription from more or less the 40s until the post-Vietnam era when the draft is abolished. I think the notion of a standing ground army as opposed to a reliance on state-based National Guards is more or less formalized and made concrete. But for the longest time, yeah, as I sort of remarked at the jump, the founders were concerned about having a standing army, again, because it sort of resembled the old world European experience, that it would be a temptation for an executive to use, and that just the notion of a large standing military was in some ways that was on ground, right? Like stationed near your home or property was somehow incommensurate with freedom and liberty in the United States.
Thank you very much. We are now going to pass to Kathy for some audience questions.
Great.
Thank you, Jewel and Jordan. Thank you, Tova. Great questions. And Reid, we really appreciate just all of your great insights. We do have some audience questions. First, I'm going to give a shout out to teachers and classrooms that are with us today. We have Cherie Stiegel with some homeschool students watching, D'Angela Hines with Emerald Coast Christian Academy, Christina Kozak with students at Menlo Park Terrace number 19, and Cami Wainhouse with Homeschool Student. So welcome to all of our teachers and students. And if you're a teacher or a student watching and we didn't give you a shout out, type your name in the Q&A and we'll try to get to you before the end of the podcast. We also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. KKVV airs these podcasts on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone listening in Las Vegas. So Reid, we've got some great audience questions here. We're going to start with Cher G, who asks, didn't Washington advise us to stay out of foreign war in his farewell address? Where did this position shift in history?
Yes, absolutely. Washington's farewell was considered the guiding mantra for nearly 100 years, or maybe a little more than 100 years after it was delivered. It was read in every Congress, and that notion of avoiding entangling alliances was sacrosanct. I think that most historians note a departure from that wisdom around the time of the Spanish-American War in 1898, where America commits itself to a more global posture with the seizure of the Philippines, and suddenly no longer kind of content with the sort of sea to shining sea, manifest destiny approach to continental endeavors. America, now to paraphrase John Quincy Adams, goes abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that was removed, one would say, from, I think, the wisdom underlying Washington's farewell, and you know, which I think is a foundational document upon which many of our representatives today ought to reflect upon. So yeah, I would probably peg it to that 1898 Spanish-American War, when frankly, like, America is not threatened, right? The Spanish are perhaps unpleasant, and their endeavors in Cuba and the Philippines are unjust and immoral. But this was not about the life and limb of U.S. citizens or our domestic sovereignty or protection of the American kind of home soil. This was a war that extended our power in a way that I think Washington would have admonished against. Great question.
Thank you. Now, Andrew K asks, if a foreign nation, for example, Iran, declares war on the U.S., is it incumbent upon the Congress to respond to that? And if not, to what degree can the president act unilaterally?
Yeah, that's a good question. Historically, we have responded in kind to declarations of war, most notably after Pearl Harbor, when Nazi Germany, which originally had not wanted to pick a fight with us, declared war on us, and we reciprocated, declaring war against Nazi Germany days after our declaration of war against Imperial Japan. At present, tough to say. I mean, what the kind of the criterion of understanding for declarations of war in international law is different now than it was at the time of the Second World War. I mean, could you argue that perhaps the Houthis have declared war against the United States, or our shipping, is like Iran in particular, I think would be loath to declare war. I think if they did declare war, I'm not sure that the U.S. Congress would declare war. I suspect that if hostilities ensued, I could imagine an authorization for use of military force. It's hard for me to imagine even a reciprocal declaration of war at this point in time, given unless some hostile power was about to erupt through our, if China was allied with Mexico and threatening our southern border or something like that, then maybe a declaration of war. Short of that, I find it difficult to imagine such perilous circumstances as we would kind of commit to the executive such staggering power. But I do think that we will generally respond in kind. Oftentimes, executives have. I think this is maybe more to the point. If Iran were to declare war against us and to start shooting at us, and I think there's a lot of recent historical precedent here, recent presidents have relied on their rather capacious understanding of their Article II commander-in-chief authorities to respond in a sort of tit-for-tat fashion. If you shoot at us, we'll shoot back at you. So my guess is, it would probably resemble something like that, relying on Article II as opposed to a declare war or maybe a UMF.
Okay. One of our students, Kenyon Wanos, age 15, asks, what are the effects of our more global presence in the world as opposed to the first 50 to 100 years where we stayed out of foreign wars?
That's a very good question. I think, from my estimation, and this, I think reasonable people can disagree about this. I think in recent times, some of our wars abroad that we would have avoided in the nation's sort of founding years and those decades that followed have had negative and unintended consequences that are broadly that they have not done much to advantage American security or international stability. So I think that much of the wisdom that was found in our Constitution about the slow, steady, and deliberate congressional consideration of when and how we go to war has been ignored, and that has been to the detriment of our country in a number of different ways. I think these wars have been enormously expensive. The sort of post 9/11 wars have cost more than $8 trillion. That's a quarter of our national debt. I think they have had deleterious impacts on the balance between the executive and congressional branches, right? I think we've talked a lot about that. Congress has learned to sort of acquiesce to the executive, which is, I think, disordered the appropriate balance of power between these two Madisonian branches. I think our wars have had a lingering impact on those that have fought them, right? So we have a lot of stress at the Veterans Administration. Despite its largest budget, the VA currently serves fewer former service members than any before time. I think veteran suicide and all sorts of other kind of unfortunate circumstances that could not have been necessarily wholly anticipated before we enacted those wars have come back to haunt us. And we're still kind of often stuck in traps of our own making, still taking fire in Iraq, still taking fire in Syria, despite no congressional or constitutional authority to be there. And risking, frankly, broader regional war that I don't think could plunge us into a drastic and dramatic recession. I think that it is to our detriment that the sage wisdom of the founders has not been followed as closely as perhaps those generations that immediately followed the enaction of our Constitution would have led.
Well, thank you. And just with our short time left, if you could tell us just a little bit about Stand Together. Y'all do great work at Stand Together, and a little bit about what you're doing over there.
Yeah, sure, my pleasure. So Stand Together is a philanthropy, but much, much more, working on a number of key policy issues where we think there may exist some shared intellectual and bipartisan energy to affect change. These issues relate to everything from economic policy to education policy to labor and the future of work. I have the good fortune of leading our foreign policy efforts, where we consider U.S. military grand strategy, veterans affairs broadly understood, not just confined, how America honors its social contract to the men and women that have served in uniform, and international kind of economic policy, trade and commercial considerations. So, you know, we work closely with other organizations that are more, you know, kind of tilted in the political direction, groups like Concerned Veterans for America that do really terrific work, and we're proud to call them colleagues. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. Again, it's a real pleasure.
Well, thank you. We've really enjoyed having you today. And I know we all learned a lot. And I want to toss it back to Tova and Jewel and Jorn with any closing comments.
Just thank you so much for being on and for all the work you do. And thank you all for watching.
Yes, thank you all for watching, and great show, Mr. Smith. You taught us all so much, and it gave us everybody a lot to think about. So please join us next week, and thank you again for being here.
Yes, next Tuesday on January 30th, we're going to have Dr. Carone Skinner speaking with us about national sovereignty. So we'll see y'all next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank y'all.